As my subscribers are probably aware, for the past 2 years I have been trying to raise money to pay for 2 tickets aboard a Soyuz flight around the moon. The goal of this fundraise is to find out A. whether or not the cislunar radiation is survivable, and B. how many members of the pro-NASA side are willing to make good on the claim that a conspiracy theorist will not believe Apollo was real even if flown to the moon themselves and shown the relics. Originally, the company Space Adventures were selling these tickets for $100 million each. Now they've gone up to $150 million each. However, it has just come to my attention that in either case, I'm getting ripped off. On March 20, 2012, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk told the BBC that in as little as 10 or 15 years from now, his company will offer tourists a trip aboard his Dragon spacecraft all the way to the surface of Mars and back again to Earth for only $500,000 per seat. That's 300 times less than what Space Adventures is asking for a lunar flyby.
My vision is for a fully reusable rocket transport system between Earth and Mars that it is able to refuel on Mars. This is very important, so you don't have to carry the return fuel on, with you when you go there. But the whole system is reusable. Every bit is nothing's thrown away. That's very important because then you're just down to the cost of the propellant. And then, of course, the smart move is to pick the propellant that is the lowest energy cost propellant. So I'm actually, we'll probably unveil the overall strategy later this year with in a little more detail. But I'm quite confident that it could work and that ultimately we could offer trips to Mars, or rather, offer someone a round trip to Mars that even that the average person could afford. Or let's say the average person after they've acquired some savings. I think the threshold is say approximately $500,000, or which would be, I guess, maybe 350,000 pounds or something like that.
Right.
And essentially, could a middle class person sell all their stuff on Earth and move to Mars if they wanted to? That's the threshold, I think, for making life multiplanetary.
I mean, I have to stop you there because that figure that you're talking about, £200,000, is roughly comparable. It's pretty much dollars for pounds. It's pretty much what Richard Branson's talking about for a suborbital flight of duration that's measured in minutes. And you're talking about round trip to Mars on chemicals. So you're talking what? A round trip of perhaps a year to Mars here for 250,000 pounds. I mean, even I might sell a house for that.
Actually, I believe it can be done for approximately $500,000. I'm not sure exactly what the current dollar-pound exchange rate is. I know it used to be 1.5 to 1, so that's why I suggested sort of 350,000 pounds. I'm not sure exactly what the number is. Yeah. But call it $500,000, and that's the math I worked out, and that's the price probably 10 years after the journeys start. So it's not necessarily the price at day one. But I'm confident that can be the price in the long term.
And to be clear, we're talking a sort of a circum-Martian flight here. We're not talking about landing on Mars. We're talking about the sort of thing that would go out however many 100 million kilometers and orbit Mars and come back. Is that correct? Is that what you're talking about?
No, land on Mars.
Land on Mars as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A round-trip ticket, $500,000. It can be done.
And
I wasn't sure until last year that it could be done, but I finally worked out the last bits of the equation, and I'm quite confident it can be done.
And you're going to unveil this later this year, are you? This strategy?
I think either later this year or early next.
Until SpaceX's plan is officially unveiled, all we can do for now is speculate on how they propose shielding space travelers from radiation and getting them to the Martian surface and back again. Based on all the available information, I have come up with some theories. A few months ago, I learned that SpaceX had joined forces with Dr. Franklin-Chang Diaz. Dr. Chang Diaz has for some time been working on a new plasma rocket called Variable Specific Impulse Magnetoplasma Rocket, or VASIMR for short. His rocket would use argon or hydrogen fuel and nuclear reactors for power. The reactors would power electromagnet coils to heat the fuel into a plasma gas, which is then channeled out through the exhaust nozzles. This plasma gas would accelerate the spacecraft to 203,000 kilometers per hour. Traveling that fast would get the craft to Mars in as little as 39 days. Normally it takes 7 months to get there. As for protection against radiation, Dr. Chang Diaz proposes shielding the living quarters with the actual propellant tanks. Because the International Space Station generates hydrogen as a byproduct that is then vented out into space, it has been proposed that this is where they would get enough fuel for the trip. And to protect space travelers from the artificial radiation hazard, the nuclear reactors would be kept on the outside. It's possible that Elon Musk plans on using the VASIMR to send his Dragon to Mars. On the other hand, he might be opting for the long way instead. In the same BBC interview, Musk proposed shielding the tourists with a barrier of water.
You do have other challenges that are significant, like you're going through deep space for 6 months, and there's you've got to find ways to overcome things like solar storms, and I've got I think some ideas about that, which is to always have a column of water pointed at the sun. That's one of the issues. I think that would do the trick.
I've discussed the water shields in previous videos. John H. Malden, for example, proposes 2 meters of water. There have been proposals for even thicker shields, but let's assume 2 meters is sufficient. A spherical cabin 2 meters in diameter and surrounded by 2 meters of water would have a mass of 109 tons. But that's just the mass of the shelter. All the proposals I've read for long-duration interplanetary flights require that there be a cramped module for radiation shelter and a larger module for comfortable living quarters. Dr. James Van Hoften says that minutes to fractional hours would be acceptable exposure time to radiation during a solar flare, and that preferably the astronaut should be only minutes away from a shelter, even during a simple EVA. Let's assume that the living quarters module is identical in mass to the 16-ton Kibo laboratory on the ISS. And then of course we have the Dragon, with only 6 tons. So that entire stack would have a mass of 131 tons. Of course, it would be better to lose the shelter module and simply put 2 meters of water around the entire living quarters, thereby eliminating the need for the astronauts to transfer from one module to another during a solar flare. But that would ultimately make the stack even heavier than before. So in the end, you're looking at a minimum mass of 131 tons. Does SpaceX have anything that can lift that kind of payload? This diagram compares the relative heights and lifting capacities of all the rockets SpaceX has built or is planning to build. The largest rocket is their Falcon 20, which has a lifting capacity of 140 tons. However, that's how much can lift into low Earth orbit. During the unveiling of his Falcon 9 Heavy, Musk had stated that the payload to the Moon would be 35% of its payload to Earth orbit, and to Mars only 25%.
Sure. So the payload to Mars would be about a quarter of its payload to Leo. So we're talking about perhaps something like 30,000 pounds to trans-Mars injection. To the Moon, it'll be about maybe 35% of that, so it's sort of maybe 35,000 pounds.
If we assume the same is true for all their rockets, this means the Falcon 20 can only send 49 tons to the Moon and 35 tons to Mars. I did some reading along these lines, and I learned that the Falcon 20's second stage, which acts as the Earth departure stage, can only carry 40 to 45 tons to escape velocity. Well, that's close enough to what I estimated, but far less than the mass of the stack. However, there is a way to overcome this. It's important to remember that the reason why the rocket's payload capacity decreases depending on how far you're trying to send it is because the remaining percentage has to cover the propellant used trying to send the craft there in the first place. If a rocket's lunar payload is 35% of its payload to Earth orbit, that means the remaining 65% has to cover the propellants. And if it's 25% payload for Mars, that means we need 75% for the propellants. So if we were trying to send 131 tons of payload to the Moon, we would require 243.3 tons of propellant for the mission. And if we were trying to send it to Mars, we'd need 393 tons. Obviously, that's well outside the lifting capacity of one Falcon 20. The key word is one. Why not use 3? The Falcon 9 Heavy is simply 3 Falcon 9 cores strapped together. Similarly, the Falcon 10 Heavy will be 3 Falcon 10 cores strapped together. In both cases, this roughly triples the lifting capacity of one core. What if we were to do the same to the Falcon 20? let's suppose we strapped 3 Falcon 20 cores together, thereby creating the Falcon 20 Heavy. This would increase the lifting capacity to 420 tons for Earth orbit, 147 tons for the Moon, and 105 tons for Mars. A single Falcon 20 Heavy could easily lift 131 tons of crewed payload and ascend it to the Moon, but a Mars mission would require an Earth orbit rendezvous approach. I propose using 1 Falcon 20 to place the crewed module in Earth orbit, and 1 Falcon 20 Heavy to lift a third stage weighing 393 tons. The two would rendezvous and dock in Earth orbit, and then the third stage would make the trans-Mars injection burn. All that's left is the landing phase. We already know that SpaceX plans on using the Dragon's launch abort system to make propulsive landings onto the Moon, Mars, and even the Earth. Musk had stated that he plans on refueling his craft on Mars. I assume his plan will either require the Dragon to land near a cargo vessel landed there in advance, or that they live off the land. We know that the Dragon's engines use monomethyl hydrazine as the fuel, which is a derivative of methane. Assuming the Mars tourists will be living off the land, my guess is that Musk plans on converting the methane to monomethyl hydrazine and use it as the ascent propellants. In fact, it was proposed by scientists on the ill-fated Constellation program to use Martian methane as the fuel for the return. I'm not sure how Musk proposes shielding the tourists from the radiation whilst on the surface, but astrophysicist Eugene Parker has proposed a tunneling underground. Possibly, Musk plans on doing the same. Well, that's my educated guess at least. We'll have to wait later this year until the official announcement. And if the VASIMR turns out to be technologically feasible, or if the Falcon 20 Heavy becomes reality, maybe I'll be able to live my childhood dream and live to tell about it. In the meantime, I'm going to talk to Space Adventures about getting a discount on the lunar Soyuz tickets. If a Mars landing will cost tourists $500,000 per seat, I think $250,000 per seat would be a decent price for a moon trip. In fact, looking at the proposals, I have to say that SpaceX has the better offer. All the lunar Soyuz will do is swing around the far side of the moon and back again, whereas SpaceX's Falcon Heavy could easily put an unshielded Dragon in lunar orbit. But why stop there? Since the Dragon can make propulsive landings onto the surface, why not send a cargo Dragon onto the lunar surface with all the return fuel and then land a crewed Dragon close by? If the radiation is such a moot issue, the astronauts would then be able to get out and search for the Apollo landers on foot. Elon Musk had stated that his company has no plans to land a man on the moon themselves and are opting for Mars missions, but will happily fly anyone there if they want to go to the moon.
I'm personally not that interested in the moon because I think it's extremely difficult to establish a self-sustaining civilization there because it's just a very small rock, basically, and it doesn't have any atmosphere. The gravity differential is much greater, versus Mars. It doesn't have the natural resources that Mars has, and Mars has just vastly more water, ice, and that red color is rust. It's iron oxide, so there's plenty of metal on Mars. It's a great planet. It's a bit of a fixer-upper, but we could eventually make Mars like Earth, which you could never make the moon like Earth. Now, that said, if there's someone who desperately wants to go to the moon, we'll take them there. We're a space transport company.
You'll just drop them off on the way.
Yeah.
Today I slightly alter my fundraise. I aim to raise at least $500,000 to pay for myself and an Apollo believer to fly the Dragon to the moon. The $300 million goal will be a worst-case scenario. Regardless of whether we use the Dragon or the Soyuz, we will be able to find out firsthand whether or not the radiation is survivable. The Dragon, of course, has the advantage of being cheaper and actually able to enter lunar orbit and land on the moon.